This is a story about people and relationships, and what it means to be steadfast in a turbulent world. It's a story about the opportunity and heartbreak of coffee markets for small, economically vulnerable producers. But it's mostly a story about people who see the world differently and are brave enough to take the big, seemingly irrational and impossible leaps to bring a new way of doing things into existence. I'm Michelle Fish. My husband, Bob, is the co-CEO of one of the largest coffee shop chains in the United States. And together, we are the founders of One Big Island in Space. We're on a mission to change the way coffee is bought and sold around the world. We've been traveling the globe looking for millions of pounds of coffee from producers that are doing the right thing for their people, for the planet, and for their communities. When we find them, we connect them to a marketplace of buyers that will pay them the right price for their coffee, now and for years to come. It's a model that is beyond fair trade and beyond USDA organic. We call it Farm Direct. Our visits don't always work out, but we won't stop going until we can put a name, a face, and a place on every cup of coffee we serve. I'd like you to meet Maria Esther Sot and Pascual Castillo. They are the proprietors of Cofincaf in Chiapas, Mexico. Getting to Finca La Fortaleza isn't easy. It's about 4 hours by car from the airport at Villahermosa. As you drive, you climb into the rugged mountains and hidden valleys of Chiapas. It is a very tough life in these mountain villages. The primary economic opportunity is agriculture, and, like small farmers all over the world, it's hard to make a good living growing subsistence and commodity crops. Access to education and healthcare is scarce to non-existent. Birth rates are high, and so are infant mortality rates. In many of these communities, people speak their indigenous languages and still celebrate their Mayan heritage through their cultural customs and their dress. We leave the pavement and catch a first glimpse of La Fortaleza when we see its red roof across a verdant valley. Its manicured grounds and beautiful main building are out of place in this rugged region. And the first time I sat on the veranda here, I wondered where the money came from to build all of this. In 1986, Pascual and his father went into the coffee business together. They built their first dry mill and started scouring the coffee-growing regions of Mexico to find farmers who they could buy from. Over time, they built a very successful processing and exporting business, shipping millions of pounds of coffee all over the world every year. The vast majority of the region's crop comes from growers with 2 hectares or less. That's about 5 acres. Pascual's respect for these small producers runs deep. He forged partnerships in these communities and invested in these producers to improve their agronomy and get them better prices for their coffee. Pascual and Maria Esther took us to see the places where they get their coffee, places that are considered too dangerous for foreign tourists, places that even the Mexican government is wary to visit. There has always been tension between the indigenous communities in Chiapas and the larger Mexican society. Economic inequality, lack of access to basic services, and exploitive land management policies are a few of the many complaints that always simmered below the surface. When the local indigenous population began to mobilize politically through protest, the Mexican government responded with a brutal repression campaign. The violence began to escalate. Attacks became common. Most of the other big companies pulled out. Even Pascual's company. His drivers refused to go pick up the harvested coffee in the area. The risk of violence was just too high. But that was devastating for the small producers, Pascual's partners, whose families depended on getting their crop to market. So, over the very strong objections of his family and his friends, Pascual went himself, several times a week, all through the harvest season. When I asked him why he would take that kind of personal risk, he told me that the small producers were counting on him, and he felt that he would be protected from being shot or kidnapped because the people in these communities knew he had always done right by the farmers. As we tour these villages and meet these farmers, we can feel their trust for Pascual, and we can see how important coffee is. But as the impacts of climate change worsen, it feels like disaster is lurking just around the corner. Roya, otherwise known as rust, is a fungus that attacks the leaves of a coffee plant. Left untreated, it can defoliate the plant, thus killing it. It spreads easily by wind, rain, and touch, and the wetter the conditions, the easier the spread. There has always been rust in coffee fields in Central and South America. But starting in 2011, producers began seeing much more of it attack their fields, and many of them lost a significant percentage of their crop to the disease. Then, in 2014, it all came to a head. Coffee production went to zero in Chiapas. As a result, all of the multinational corporations pulled out, again. After all, there wasn't any coffee to buy, so why stay? Never mind what happens to those left behind. Tens of thousands of small producers were devastated. All of Pascual's friends and partners in the region lost the ability to feed their families with coffee, and they had to make brutal and difficult decisions to stay alive. Pascual and Maria Esther saw an opportunity to help. At the time, La Fortaleza was a cattle farm, and the immediate need was for small farmers to have a way to feed themselves. So they sold their cattle, and they hired a small army of their partners from over the decades to help them convert the cattle farm into a coffee farm. The labor required to turn the deforested land and compacted soil of a cattle farm back into agricultural land is enormous. They consulted the most talented researchers on coffee for information on the best rust-resistant varieties, and they started a nursery for hundreds of thousands of plants they intended to give away to the small producers for free. The first crop of seedlings failed, so they did it over again. Eventually, they grew and gave away more than 2 million rust-resistant plants in just a few years. They taught the producers to use beans and corn they had planted as the first form of shade for their new coffee seedlings. That way, they could still grow a crop to eat or sell while transitioning back to coffee. And then they empowered and paid them to teach their neighbors. It took time, but by 2017, Fortaleza's transformation back into a coffee farm was largely complete, and the landscape had changed completely. Both the physical landscape of the farm and the landscape of opportunities among the small producers in Chiapas. When you walk the fields at Finca La Fortaleza now, it's hard to imagine that they were ever anything but a healthy, productive coffee farm. The shade trees are all grown up, and the temperature is cool under the trees. The river is clean and flows vigorously through the land. The sound of birds is your constant accompaniment to the beautiful, verdant landscape. Coffee is again a viable crop in the region. La Fortaleza works with around 2,000 small producers to help improve quality and yields so their coffee will fetch a higher price on the market. In January of 2023, we officially began buying 200,000 pounds of coffee from Cofincaf. 60% of it comes from Finca La Fortaleza, and 40% from 4 small producers they work with. I look forward to telling you more about Miguel Angel Cruz, Don Pascual Hernandez, Solomon de Meza, Marta Vasquez, and their families, their farms, and their dreams. Without the tireless work of Pascual and Maria Esther, it is extremely unlikely that Obis would ever have been able to find these 4 producers or anyone like them. They would have been too small, too off the grid to ever reach our radar. But small growers like them make up the vast majority of coffee production in the world. The more we can learn their names, recognize their faces, and introduce them to the larger coffee world, the harder it will be for us to ignore the impacts of the coffee we buy.